14.
Think about that age for a moment. At 14, most of us are worried about algebra or what we might want to be when we grow up. At 14, you are still legally a child. You aren't allowed to vote. You aren't allowed to drive. And in the eyes of the law, you aren't yet responsible enough to make major life decisions. But in 1944, the state of South Carolina decided that 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was old enough to die. He wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a skinny kid, barely 95 pounds, who still played outside with his sisters and rode his bike through the dusty streets of a small mill town. But he lived in a time and a place where the color of your skin determined the value of your innocence. This is the story of the shortest trial in modern history, a mask that didn't fit, and a 70-year journey to prove that a boy who was executed in minutes was innocent all along. To understand what happened to George, you have to understand Alcaloo. In the 1940s, Alcaloo was a company town. The local sawmill owned almost everything, the houses, the stores, and in many ways the people. The town was split clean in half by the railroad tracks. It wasn't just a geographic divide, it was a moral and social one. On one side lived the white families who ran the mill. On the other side, in the shadows of the lumber yards, lived the black families. Everyone knew the rules. You didn't cross those tracks unless you had a reason to be there. It was an environment built on a fragile, forced peace, a peace that was about to be shattered. March 24th, 1944, started like any other spring day. George and his younger sister, Amy, were grazing the family's cow near the railroad tracks. Two young white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, were out riding their bicycles, looking for wildflowers called maypops. They approached George and Amy and asked a simple question. "Do you know where the flowers grow?" George told them he didn't. The girls pedaled away toward the white side of town. When the girls didn't return by nightfall, the town of Alcaloo went into a frenzy. Hundreds of people, both black and white, joined the search. George's own father, George Sr., was among them, helping look for the missing children. During the search, George mentioned to someone that he had seen the girls earlier that day. He was trying to help. He had no idea that by speaking up, he was signing his own death warrant. The next morning, the girls' bodies were found in a water-filled ditch. They had been brutally beaten with a railroad spike. The town wanted blood, and the police wanted a suspect fast. Within hours, the police arrived at the Stinney home. They didn't come with a warrant or forensic evidence. They came for George. While his parents were away, police took George and his older brother John into custody. While they eventually released John, they kept George. They took a 14-year-old boy into a room and locked the door. For hours, George was interrogated alone. No lawyer was present. His parents weren't allowed to see him. No one was there to protect him from the weight of the state. By the time the door opened, the police claimed they had a confession. They said George admitted to the murders because he wanted to have sex with one of the girls. There was no written confession. There was no recording. There was only the word of white officers against a terrified black child. The speed of what followed is difficult to comprehend today. George was moved to a jail in a different city because the threat of a lynch mob was so high. His father was fired from the sawmill immediately. His family was threatened with death and forced to flee the town, leaving George completely alone. When the trial began on April 24th, just 1 month after the murders, George stood in a courtroom filled with hundreds of white people. No black residents were allowed inside. His court-appointed lawyer was a man named Charles Plowden, a tax commissioner who was preparing for a political run. He didn't want this case. He didn't call a single witness. He didn't cross-examine the police. He didn't even ask for a change of venue, despite the atmosphere of pure hatred in the room. The entire trial lasted barely 3 hours. The jury took exactly 10 minutes to deliberate. They came back with a verdict: guilty. No recommendation for mercy. The judge sentenced George to death by electrocution. On June 16, 1944, George walked into the execution chamber carrying a Bible under his arm. He was 5 feet 1 inch tall. He weighed 95 pounds. He was so small that he didn't fit into the electric chair's restraints. The guards had to use the Bible he brought with him as a booster seat, so his head could reach the electrodes. When they flipped the switch, the first surge of electricity caused the oversized mask to slip from his face. His eyes were open, filled with tears, as the witnesses watched the child die. He was pronounced dead after 8 minutes. From the time of the crime to the time of his death, only 81 days had passed. For 70 years, the Stinney family lived with the shadow of this conviction. They knew George was with Amy when the girls were killed. They knew he was innocent. It wasn't until 2013 that legal advocates and the surviving Stinney siblings finally got their day in court. They presented new evidence, testimony from George's siblings that provided a rock-solid alibi, and a statement from a cellmate who said George had always maintained his innocence. In December 2014, Judge Carmen Mullen vacated George's conviction. She didn't just say the trial was unfair. She said it was a violation of the fundamental rights of a human being. She noted that the confession was likely coerced and that the defense was non-existent. 70 years too late, George was no longer a convicted murderer. The execution of George Stinney Jr. is one of the darkest chapters in American history. George never got to grow up. He never got to have a family, a career, or a full life. His story remains a haunting reminder of what happens when a legal system chooses speed over substance and prejudice over proof. His case is a reminder that justice is not always what happens in a courtroom. Sometimes justice is a long, slow climb out of a deep, dark hole, a climb that takes generations to complete. George Stinney was a boy, and the system took his life. We tell his story today so that we never forget the cost of silence.